Use headphone for better experience.
He told the world he was going fishing on Christmas Eve, and by nightfall a small city held its breath for the wife who never came home. The wife whose son was due in weeks. In Modesto, neighbors strung lights and handed out flyers, while a smiling husband rehearsed alibis, and the Bay kept its own counsel. In the days just before Christmas 2002, Modesto smelled like fireplaces and citrus. The lawns on Covina Avenue wore glowing reindeer, and porch rails were wrapped in ribbons of light that blinked like steady heartbeats. Laci Peterson, 8 months pregnant, the kind of pregnant that turns a woman's walk into a gentle sway, had plans the way expectant mothers have plans. A last-minute errand, a recipe to try, a nap she joked she'd never take. The dog, a golden retriever named Mackenzie, was part of her daily circuit, a neighborly presence that made people smile when they saw her approaching. She had a way of making the ordinary feel rehearsed and bright, like a scene you've seen before in a film, and still love when it returns. On the morning of December 24th, Scott said he watched his wife in black maternity pants and a white shirt, tidying, getting ready for the day. Then he loaded his truck, said he was headed to the Berkeley Marina to try out a small aluminum boat. Fishing, he said, striper, sturgeon, words that belong to another, slower holiday. This is the part of a story that later grows heavy with hindsight. The mundane detail that will be asked to wear a different costume. But in the moment, it was just a man and a plan, a wife and a day ahead of her. By midday, the first seam split. A neighbor found Mackenzie wandering the neighborhood with his leash on, the sort of thing that could happen by accident. A latch not caught, a gate nudged open by wind, but that rarely does when a meticulous person is home. The neighbor tucked the dog into the Peterson yard. Afternoon grew thin. Laci did not answer calls. She did not arrive where she was meant to, because she could not. When Scott returned, he called family and then police. He said he had gone north, launched at the Berkeley Marina, cruised the gray water, cast a line, felt the cold settle in his fingers, then returned to find an empty house and a missing wife who was due to give birth in a month to a boy they had named Connor. He said it straight, and he said it often, because that is what you do when a story first arrives. You repeat it until you believe it belongs to you. The first night was the raw kind of cold that makes searchlights look like frozen columns. Officers knocked on doors and wrote down routine answers. The Modesto Police Department, led by detectives who had learned to wear their composure like a uniform, began with the circle closest to Laci: family, friends, neighbors. The house, tidy but lived in, offered nothing that shouted. The truck, the warehouse where Scott kept his tools for a fertilizer business, the small aluminum boat, these were just nouns at first. The bay was the bay, a patient sheet laid out under a winter sky. The dog waited by the door the way dogs do, having already told the most important thing he had to tell by wandering back with a leash, unsteered by a hand. In those first days, the city braided itself into something like purpose. Volunteers fanned out, stapling flyers with Laci's smiling photograph to telephone poles already wearing their holiday ribbons. News vans arrived like migratory birds, their masts tilting toward the sky. The kind of generous theater that Americans know how to produce assembled quickly. Tables for sign-up sheets, stacks of water bottles, boxy coffee dispensers, a map with pins creeping outward. Boats were launched to search the sloughs and the delta. Helicopters looked down on orchards and wheat-colored fields. A woman who had been a daughter and a sister and a neighbor was now also a missing person, and that phrase has its own gravity. Scott stood before microphones and said the sentences anyone would say: "We love her. Please help. Call if you know anything." He held flyers in his hands the way a man might hold a shield. Beside him stood Laci's family, eyes swollen with a blend of hope and dread, learning how to make their private sorrow public. If you watched without knowing the next chapters, it looked like the practiced choreography of an unfolding search. If you rewound the tape later, it looked like a man practicing lines for a part whose ending he could not control. Within a week, the case had two speeds: the public search, all maps and megaphones, and the quiet collection of small facts. Detectives went to the marina and walked the docks, tracing where Scott said he had launched. They visited the warehouse and found the aluminum boat, a 14-foot V-hull with the unassuming shine of utility. They noted a homemade anchor shaped from concrete. They saw a pair of pliers with a strand of hair, dark and long. Later, a lab would say it was consistent with Laci's mitochondrial DNA, a phrase that entered the public vocabulary the way technical phrases do when the world needs them to carry fear. They drove to a store where the clerk remembered a purchase of cement mix in late December, and they wrote the receipt numbers down, the kind of small integer that can later feel like fate. The holiday ended and the new year began, but not for the people at the center of the search. Searchers combed parks, canals, alleys, and thickets that made their arms itch. The water called to the investigators, as water always does in missing person cases. It is both a fact of geography and a metaphor that chases detectives in their sleep. If a man took a boat onto the bay, then the bay must be asked to answer. So they asked with sonar, with patrols that learned the language of currents, with maps layered in colored lines representing where the tide might take a secret if given time. Then, the twist the country would come to know as the fulcrum. A woman named Amber Frey, a massage therapist in Fresno, watching the televised pleas and feeling the dissonance bloom in her chest. She had been seeing Scott. He had said he was single. He had told a story about being a widower when the Christmas season hurt too much. A lie so theatrical that it felt like a confession spoken backward. When Amber walked into a police station and said, "I think you need to hear this," she opened a door inside the case that air rushed through. Detectives, balancing sorrow with strategy, asked her to help. She agreed. She recorded phone calls where Scott's voice threaded charm and calm, and, to some ears, the flatness of a man whose world had already moved to another stage. Those calls changed the flavor of public listening. Before, he was the worried husband. After, he was the man telling one woman the holidays would be hard because of a death that had not yet occurred, while asking another to remain strong as the search for his wife continued. The country watched and sorted itself as it always does. Some saw damning duplicity. Others saw a man grasping for comfort made reckless by lies. In Modesto, the flyers kept fluttering. In the bay, the tide kept speaking in a language no one could decode fast enough. Months accumulated. Trees in Modesto grew a new skin of leaves and shed them again. The case became a season more than a headline. And then April arrived, and with it the ocean's brutal precision. On a morning when fog clung low to the edges of the East Bay, a passerby along the shoreline north of the Berkeley Marina found the remains of a small body, the size that turns a stranger's breath into a gasp. The next day, a torso, female, surfaced a short distance away. There are sentences that must be written with care. The bodies were identified through DNA. The baby the family had named Connor had come to shore first. The mother followed. The geography drew a ring around Scott's alibi, and the air grew very still. He was in San Diego by then, near the Mexican border, in a car that contained cash, multiple cell phones, a driver's license not his own, camping equipment, and hair dyed not successfully enough to be anonymous. When officers arrested him, a certain portion of the country felt the logic resolve into something close to relief. Another portion, a smaller one, held back, awaiting trial, clinging to the legal rhythm that says proof must be offered properly, not simply assumed. He was charged with 2 counts of murder. One for Laci, one for the unborn child California law recognized as a victim. The courtroom would be in San Mateo County, moved from Modesto because Modesto had already become a public square too crowded with conviction. Trials are long rooms where the air must be shared by people who disagree about everything except the spelling of the names. The prosecution told the story straight. Motive wrapped in adultery and the burdens of new fatherhood. Opportunity in a boat and a solitary trip to a cold bay. Means in a man who bought cement, made anchors, and could carry a body into water unobserved because the day was gray and the docks were quiet. They laid out timelines built from phone pings, receipts, and habits. They pointed to the strand of hair found in the pliers on the boat. They asked the jury to follow the line between the Marina Scott named on the day Laci vanished and the shoreline where she and her son had washed ashore months later. The defense, led by a lawyer used to rooms with television cameras, told another story. No eyewitnesses to a crime, no blood in the house, no confession, a case built on absence and an ocean that drags anything in its grasp wherever it wishes. A young pregnant woman who could have encountered danger on a walk. A husband whose lies about romance made him a cad but not a killer. They held up the bay like a question mark. They asked jurors to picture all the small, unobserved spaces in a life, the places where narrative can smuggle in a different author. The jury listened, and the cameras watched. The public oscillated between fascination and fatigue, because that is the rhythm of long trials. There were days in which the science of tides turned the courtroom into a lecture hall. There were days in which a recorded phone call between Scott and Amber returned everyone to the small theater of seduction and deceit. Family members testified. The courtroom felt crowded with the ordinary objects of a life paused. Photographs of holidays, baby shower lists, a nursery arranged in expectation that had to be repurposed for evidence. The judge, measured, patient, ruled on objections like a metronome. Jurors took notes, looked tired, went home each night to rooms where the television said their names without saying them. In November 2004, they returned with a verdict. They found him guilty of first-degree murder for Laci and second-degree murder for her son. The penalty phase, which asks citizens to answer a question no one trained them for, what is the proper cost of a life, ended with death. The courtroom absorbed the sound of people crying in that mixed way that grief and grim vindication sound the same if you only listen to the air. Outside cameras blinked, and pundits arranged their notes into certainty. The story could have stopped there, but American law is designed to keep the ending from being too sudden. Appeals began. The way appeals do. Filings measured in pages and years. In 2020, the California Supreme Court reviewed the case and said the death sentence could not stand because jurors had been dismissed improperly for their general opposition to capital punishment, not for an inability to follow the law, an important difference in a state that requires a particular kind of neutrality when deciding who can sit in judgment of life. The murder convictions remained. In 2021, he was resentenced to life without parole. The long, careful mechanisms kept turning. Allegations of juror misconduct. One juror, it was argued, had failed to disclose involvement in her own restraining order case and therefore carried bias, were weighed by a judge who listened to testimony, reviewed records, and denied a new trial. Appellate courts later declined to overturn the conviction. The arc bent toward permanence. And yet the case does not live in casebooks alone. It lives in the ordinary inheritance of those who loved Laci and the son she never got to meet. It lives in the way Modesto watches Christmas lights flicker now, with a softness made from vigilance. It lives in the caution new investigators carry when they see a missing person whose spouse's story points to water, not as prejudice but as a reminder that the simplest lines may be the truest ones. It lives, too, in the public's sharpened appetite for detail, The way people now ask for receipts and phone logs, for the proofs that can stand when memory wobbles. Tell it straight, and it is this. A woman on the cusp of motherhood vanished. Months later, she and her child came home the only way the ocean delivers those it has taken. A husband's lies about love braided themselves into a rope the prosecution used to climb from suspicion to certainty. A jury agreed. The sentence changed in a later decade because the rules for choosing who can weigh that question were not honored, but the core judgment remained. You could fill a courthouse with the debates about circumstantial evidence and its power, about the mapping of currents across a windy bay, about whether a life built on a particular cocktail of charm and deceit can also be capable of murder. You could debate forever and still return to the same small, unbearable fact. Laci's nursery remained a room for a baby who did not arrive. What do you do with a story like this when the sirens are long quiet and the rabbit-thick headlines have thinned? You fold it into caution and compassion and teach it the rules of privacy. You say her name without letting his swallow it whole. You imagine the mornings she would have had. Cereal crumbs brushed from a high chair, the dog learning to share a couch with a squirming toddler. Phone calls to a mother who would have said, "I'm coming right over." You let that vision live in the same house as the record of a trial, because the human truth can be wider than the legal one. There were other lives changed by the gravity of it all. Amber Frey, who walked into a police station and said, "I need to tell you something," went from private citizen to witness with a nation in her pocket. She was criticized and praised, sometimes in the same breath, and learned what it is to have people mistake your part in a story for the whole of you. Detectives who were young then built the case into their old age, not as a single triumph, but as a reminder of how small observations, a receipt, a strand of hair on a tool in a boat, can carry entire continents of meaning. Prosecutors learned again a lesson that trials teach the way tide teaches a shoreline. That a jury's patience is as important as its passion. That you must tell a story that holds together not just with theater, but with the steel wire of sequence and proof. And the bay itself, flat as pewter on some days, snarling with whitecaps on others, remains a character in everyone's memory. People who live along its edges say that on winter mornings, when fog takes over and the world becomes a set of silhouettes, they remember the search boats and the lines of volunteers in parkas, and they send a small private mercy out across the gray. The marina can look like any marina. Gulls worried about scraps, a man knotting a line with a skill his father taught him, a child pointing at the distant bridge as if it were a toy. But the people who know remember where the pin went into the map all those years ago. Memory attaches itself to place. It makes ordinary docks into sites of prayer. Sometimes the stories that hold us hardest are the ones that refuse to be clever. There's no twist you can add that would make this one more bearable or more fair. There's only the work of telling it carefully and the work of walking away from it without letting it numb you. In Modesto, there are still neighbors who recall the dog with the leash trailing, the volunteer tables, the candlelight vigils where people sang even though singing felt impossible. If you ask them, they will tell you that the thing they remember most clearly is not the cameras or the lawyers' names, but the way the winter air felt on their cheeks as they stood with strangers, because standing together was the only thing that made sense. Years later, a young detective might drive past Covina Avenue and slow down without thinking. He wasn't on the job back then. He learned the case in academy lectures, and in the way older officers talk when a name passes between them like a coin. He slows because the house is part of his education, because every missing person report he reads from now on will carry a shadow of this one. He may never tell anyone that he does this. He will just drive, look at the tidy lawns, the porches with chairs waiting for conversation, and then drive on, carrying the small weight of a story that taught him how to believe evidence and still hold sadness correctly. It ends, if it ends, not with neat repair, but with a coil of promises ordinary people keep without announcing them. A promise to take a neighbor's concern seriously the first time. A promise to tell the truth in small, unglamorous rooms so that larger rooms can be honest later. A promise to say the names of the lost when it is easier to rehearse the names of those who took them. A promise to imagine the life that was meant to follow the hushed December morning. The first birthday cake smeared, the second, the one after that. In keeping those promises, you honor the one thing a courtroom cannot produce on its own: a future. So the story runs from a quiet neighborhood glittering with holiday lights to a wind-chopped bay, and back into a courthouse where 12 people wrote an ending the law recognizes. Afterward, the law revised the sentence and left the rest in place. The people who loved Laci fill the spaces where remembrance belongs, with acts that are stubborn and soft: planting a tree, cooking the recipe she once loved, speaking about missing women with a fierceness that doesn't need microphones to be heard. The rest of us, who only knew her after the floodlights came, can choose to carry the human version more tenderly than the headlines did. We can let the last image be the one before the story broke. A woman smiling on a sidewalk, a dog's leash looped around her hand, the air full of December and promise. The courtroom, once the brightest room in the story, gradually dimmed into paperwork and quiet halls. But the people stayed luminous in the ways that matter. Jurors returned to jobs that required different kinds of patience: fixing engines, checking inventory, getting a class of fourth graders to line up without stepping on each other's shoelaces, and discovered a new noise inside their skulls: the long, humming aftersound of evidence. Some kept their notebooks for a while, private ledgers of weeks when strangers leaned on them. Others tore out the pages and fed them to the kitchen trash, as if releasing a weather system that had set up house behind their eyes. They learned the world doesn't applaud jurors, not really. It simply moves past them with a nod, and maybe that is best. The job asks for service, not a monument. Reporters boxed their tapes and moved on to the next emergency the public required. A few saved one photograph in a drawer, Laci's smiling face beneath the word "missing," as if to remind themselves that the work is not only the performance of asking questions into microphones. The best of them took from this case a quieter ambition: to write carefully around the living and the dead, to keep the lens from steamrolling the heart. Detectives folded their suits over hangers and made the small repairs any long investigation requires of a person: sleep, a meal eaten without that twitchy look toward the phone, a walk that belongs to no one but the walker. Yet the case shaped them the way a heavy book shapes the shelf that holds it. When new files arrived, names of women who had not come home, maps with circles drawn around rivers and reservoirs, they felt the Modesto winter again, the search grids like stitched thread across orchards, the sound of a dog's tag tapping a collar because the animal did not know how to make grief intelligible. There is a quieter corridor in this story where paperwork lives, and it is there that the appeal years took their measured steps. Lawyers practiced a different craft than the ones who stood before the jury. They wrote into the night and woke to write again, erecting arguments out of footnotes and rulings as if out of bricks. Somewhere an associate highlighted a sentence about juror qualifications, not because it glowed with drama, but because it held the key to a door labeled penalty. The state's highest court did the work courts must do: separate the passion of a result from the method that produced it. It reached back to the moment a juror is selected and asked whether that moment was conducted correctly. The answer adjusted the sentence while leaving the core intact, like leveling a picture frame on a wall without changing the painting. Outside the institutions, the human calendar kept its appointments. Dates took on edges. December 24th, April mornings on a bay shore, verdict day, resentencing day. Anniversaries are strange mirrors. You see your current face reflected in the old moment and cannot help measuring. For Laci's family, each year added skill, not ease. They became fluent in accepting casseroles, in sitting on panels no one wants to qualify for, in telling a roomful of strangers about a daughter as if reading a love letter aloud. They said her name with a steadiness that built a kind of bridge for new listeners to cross. The bridge led to ordinary things, recipes, a laugh that showed all the teeth, her way of putting a hand on a pregnant belly as if reminding the child inside that the world would be kind. That is how you win against absence. You keep stating the particulars until the shape of the person stands in the room again. Amber learned the math of living with a public chapter that insists on being the first thing people mention. She raised her child, made a living, and practiced the quiet insistence that the rest of her life is larger than one decision to walk into a police station. In private, she likely told the story only when necessary, and in words that do not require anyone to clap. In public, she could offer the small, durable lesson a complicated story sometimes produces: that telling the truth is a service, even if it does not make you a saint. Modesto, for its part, did what towns do when they want to be more than a headline. It assigned the memory to terraces of action. One neighbor organized an annual drive for missing person search funds, because the first hours of any disappearance are greedy for resources. A teacher designed a civics assignment in which students track how a case moves from patrol car to prosecutor's desk without losing either compassion or rigor. A pastor polished a sentence for funerals that mentions how love continues to have work to do, even when the law is finished. A barista kept a jar on the counter with a modest sign about local victims' services. Coins made a sound like rain. The marina, east wind, gulls, masts ticking against their lines, became a lesson folded into the training of young officers. A sergeant would stand with hands in pockets and talk about currents, how a body does not simply float where your theory wants it to go, how tide tables resemble calendars but live like animals, how the ocean keeps its counsel unless addressed with patience and respect. It was not a grisly lecture. It was a geometry class offered by a man who spoke as if the bay could be a teacher if you did not insult it with laziness. Behind the words ran a current of mercy, the understanding that the water does not make monsters. People do. There always are, people who wrote to say they knew better. Tips arrive like weather, and you must learn which cloud formation means rain. Email inboxes collect the theories of the confident. Sightings, confessions overheard, a dream that felt so real it must be a message. Detectives gave such notes their minute, sometimes two. Most dried into nothing. A few spurred a follow-up call that built a habit of courtesy into the bones of the squad. You do not get to choose who hands you the next truth. You only get to choose whether you receive it with enough decency that the next person won't hesitate to try. The nursery never became a nursery. That refusal became a kind of liturgy. Family members turned the room into a place where memory could go to rest its feet. Photos kept dusted, the light soft, a chair placed by the window for anyone who needed to sit and say the unsayable. Now and then the dog, older, stiffer, still golden at the edges, would wander in and turn once before lying down with a sigh so deep it seemed to come from some other animal entirely, perhaps the sort that remembers more than it can tell. And what of Scott in the vanishing landscape of imprisonment? The small firmament of cinder block and correctional schedules? The story does not pretend to know the content of a man's midnight in such a place. It knows only that institutions are designed to hold a person while the community decides what to do with the ache he left behind. Appeals were filed, arguments heard, a resentencing performed. The calendar on the wall traded one horizon for another. Outside, the world reconfigured its attention. Inside, Time likely will keep its slow arithmetic until it needs no more numbers. The case continued to function as a tuning fork people struck to hear where their pitch sat. Law students read the transcripts and practiced humility, learning that circumstantial evidence is not a synonym for weak evidence. It is a description of how most of life presents itself, in patterns that become persuasive when enough of them point in the same direction. A young prosecutor drew a diagram on a yellow pad that connected the warehouse, the boat, the marina, the shoreline, the receipts, the phone calls, the strand of hair. She taped it above her desk, not as a trophy, but as a reminder to braid facts rather than stack them. A young defense lawyer reading the same record trained himself to ask better questions of water, to measure the difference between possibility and reasonable doubt with a tool more precise than personality. On certain winter evenings, the bay rests under a lid of cloud that sits so low the bridges look like pencil lines in a child's drawing. If you stand with your hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee and watch the surface, you can see the skin of the water twitch under a breeze so slight you would miss it anywhere else. That is how grief ages, too. Less whitecap, more ripple, and yet the depth remains what it always was. People who loved Laci learned to walk along such nights without checking over their shoulders for the camera crew that once lived in their peripheral vision. They bought groceries, paid bills, fixed gutters, helped children with fractions, scheduled doctor's appointments, made jokes that landed. They did not confuse survival with betrayal. They understood that a life restored to ordinary is a kind of tribute as solemn as any memorial granite. The street where the dog wandered became a route people take when they want to remember without getting swallowed. In December, porches bloom with light again. A woman bringing in packages pauses by her front steps and lets the cold touch her face in a way that wakes gratitude. A man shovels leaves from a gutter and thinks, unbidden, of a young woman with a list of errands in her head and a baby's name on her tongue. A child rides a scooter down the block and never knows that the adults watching her from living room windows are seeing two timelines at once. The one in which she zips past, cheeks bright, and another in which, years ago, a neighborhood learned it could link arms and become an answer. The story, expanded across years, resolves not into a single chord but into harmony. Law, loss, lesson. Law delivered its conclusion with teeth, and then adjusted its bite according to rules deeper than outrage. Loss remained as it always does, a house guest who no longer apologizes for sleeping on the couch. Lessons broke themselves into hand-sized pieces people could carry. Call sooner? Write down the details you'll need when your memory betrays you. Hold both science and skepticism in the same hand. Tell the names of the lost with tenderness. Don't let the shadow of a famous defendant blot out the warmth of the person he took. Near the end of a long winter, a small gathering, no speeches, no microphones, met under a clean sky. Someone brought a young tree, bare and thin as a promise. A hole was dug with the polite violence necessary to make a place for life. Hands, some of them old, some of them still carrying school ink on their fingers, helped lower the roots. Dirt was returned, pressed down gently as if tucking in a child. Water from a plastic jug made a dark ring in the soil. The people stood back. No plaque, no dates. Only a tree that would leaf out and cast an honest patch of shade on hot days. It was the opposite of a spectacle. It was exactly enough. When the wind rises in Modesto, it runs its thumb across wind chimes and basketball nets and the edges of flags, and each sings its simple note. If you listen, you can hear the town answer itself. In sirens that hurry without panic, in back doors closing soft behind teenagers who remembered their keys, in dogs that bark and then hush when the person they love comes back inside. Against that ordinary music, the case takes its final shape. A story told straight through, Beginning in a kitchen warm with December chores, widening to a bay and a courthouse, settling into a long, careful afterward where people keep their promises, so it ends where a good ending belongs. With the living making lives that do not forget, a mother's name spoken over dinner as easily as salt is passed, a child who learns without fanfare why neighbors show up with flashlights when someone is missing, an officer who kneels to tie a blue ribbon to a fence, not because the cameras are rolling, but because his hands needed a job while his heart said a small prayer. A community that learned tenderness is a kind of competence. And in that competence, in that tenderness, a future steady, workmanlike, kind.